So yeah, my name's Stanford. I am a medical doctor. I'm a psychiatrist, used to do maternity, also yoga teacher. At the moment, training in yoga therapy under Colin. And tonight G is for gender dysphoria. So I'm gonna let Colin introduce himself first.
My name is Colin. I'm a yoga therapist trainer. Been working with people one-to-one for about 20 years now, in different environments and different situations. I'm so happy to be working with Stanford now, just to be delivering yoga and yoga therapies ideas and Western medicine's ideas on different subject matters. And we've chosen tonight a kind of a delicate topic, gender dysphoria. Just the first question, I think, is what does dysphoria mean, Stanford?
So dysphoria, so not to be confused with dysmorphia, which I, for the longest time, and a little bit ashamed to admit, as a doctor, I actually got confused with. Dysphoria actually means the discomfort, the feeling of distress because something is incongruent. So when you match that with gender dysphoria, it means usually it's when you are born into one, I will use the word sex, and you self-identifying with a different gender, and then it's the stress and anxiety that is associated from that.
Thank you. So what does dysmorphia mean? Because we hear a lot about body dysmorphia. So what's dysmorphia? Because
so dysmorphia is about you're not comfortable with the imagery itself. So, you know, you're not like body dysmorphia, you're not comfortable about your body shape, body size, and body imagery. And sometimes that can either be real in reality because there's scars or certain weights or certain shape against certain body parts as well. But sometimes it can also be imaginary. It might not be completely matching with what is in the reality.
Okay. Thank you. And at the moment, so something like gender dysmorphia, what's Western medical perspective on this?
Okay, so you're asking me all the hard questions straight away. Fine.
You save some up. I've got a whole load that I'm just kind of like, you know, I've got some other ones for later on, like, you know, something like, is there such a thing as male and female? I mean, come on.
This is not going to be the whole night, is it?
Some good ones a bit later, but I mean, let's just start with some easy ones. Like I mean, what does Western medicine say about why is it a condition? You know?
So there are quite a few different standard or classification what gender dysphoria is going to be. So usually it's about how behaviorally the individual or the patient, I will explain that later, like to say dress in their opposite sex or opposite genders clothes, toys, typical behavior that is expected, or play, especially when they are very young onset in children, they prefer the opposite gender playmate, typical activities. So say very, very typically girls would be like playing with dollhouse, Barbies, and boys will be machine guns and things like that. So that is the physical, that's the typical behavior. And also at the same time, there seems to be an aversion towards their assigned gender or sex behavior. So it is quite normal to expect a young girl or boy to occasionally play with, you know, especially if they're brothers and sisters, they will play with the other kind of toys because they're curious, they want to explore, they want to play. I think one of the main things is they get a little bit averse to what is expected of them per se. So I think that is quite typical of a few of the criteria, especially if you look at Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, a bit of a mouthful. If you want to call it, just Google DSM. 5 is the current edition from 2013. And there's also the International Classification of Disease, the ICD-10, and I think the 11 is coming out quite soon. So that is usually what we're understanding of it. And I think at the moment, you know, in modern days, there's quite crossover between gender dysphoria and transgender or or transsexuality in terms of terminology. And I think maybe later on I'll go into that a little bit more, but I'll throw the question back into Colin for now. What is the yoga understanding of gender dysphoria?
Okay, so we've got the first thing, which is we've got the word dysphoria. And you define dysphoria as unease. You define dysphoria as a general dissatisfaction in life. So we've got this idea of dysphoria, so this unease, we've got a general dissatisfaction in life. There's some kind of not a right match internally that's happening. There's some kind of mismatch going on. And in fact, all yoga philosophy is about dysphoria. It's about the fact that there is this deep mismatch that's going on within the system. And yoga puts the individual first. It actually firstly puts the individual and says, look, you're a unique person. You're completely and utterly unique. It then puts the dysphoria next. It says there is this disease, there's this kind of unease, there's this something going on that you just don't feel. And one of my clients summed it up very well. They looked at me and they said, I've never, ever felt okay. And it's a really powerful statement when someone says that I've never, ever actually felt okay. And so first we have the person, and the person is the priority. Then we have this imbalance that's happening. Then we have the condition. And so the first thing that yoga says is it looks at the individual and it's prioritized the individual. The next thing is that it says that every experience and feeling that you have is valid, is true, and is real, and is important. And this is a very, very powerful statement because it's the starting point for lots of different things. It goes against lots of other different philosophies, which says actually the feelings that you have are imagination. They're not real. The whole thing is a complete illusion. So yoga's starting point is that actually the feelings that you have, the dysphoria that you have, and dysphoria itself is real. And it's a real situation. And it's a huge opportunity. So specifically what we don't find within a text like, let's say, Yoga Sutra, we don't find any reference points to genders whatsoever. And I love that because what it means is that the concept of just dysphoria, firstly, is across the board, whether you classify in any which shape and form to any human being, it's there. The second is that yoga provides the route or the safety valve in order for someone to actually accept their reality and their perspective and come to terms with it so that they can live a healthy life in the world. And for me, having that route map with everyone being an individual and having that promise that actually we can be okay with things is super helpful. Does that make any sense, Stanford?
Makes a lot of sense. And I picked up on 2 points that I think is very interesting. But before I go into them, I'm just going to say, I think both Colin and I feel a little bit uneasy on this topic itself. And I think I won't speak for Colin, I'll speak for myself. Because compared to all the other like 6 topics that we've talked about, where I have more of an experience of, I think gender dysphoria is truly the first topic that I personally can't relate. I think it's probably a good word because I didn't experience it. I never experienced it. And I just also realized that I very, probably subconsciously wore a blue top, which probably not very sensitive. I probably should go for slightly more gender neutral or gender non-associated color, but it is my favorite color. But I think, so please do forgive me if anyone find anything I shared tonight a little bit offensive or, I said about the wrong thing. As always, I encourage you to put things into the chat if you feel like you need to correct me or, you want to send me a direct message or reach out to me later just to, teach me a little bit more. I really, really welcome them because this is the one topic that I hasn't got the most knowledge of. So I do apologize. Now, the things I was going to pick up on Colin's speech was actually, you said that your client saying she never feel comfortable. And then later on, you recognize that every feeling is true. Now, as part of my research for tonight, I was watching The Danish Girl, the movie from 2015. It has got quite a lot of recognition because it was recognized by the Academy Award. So most of you probably have heard of it. But when I was watching that movie, I actually came to a very good conclusion about what gender dysphoria is. Very earlier on in the movie, I'm not going to give it too much away, but it will be a bit of spoiler alert. The Danish painter, Lily Elbow, so she said to then her wife, because at the time she was still biologically male, there's nothing wrong with me. Don't let them do this to me. And there was such a conviction about it. And I couldn't quite see the distress. Again, it wasn't a documentary, but I do believe the acting. But later on, through her being subject to a series of examination, consultation with different doctors or different friends and family, one of her old childhood friend actually came to like, what has happened to you? Like, how have you changed? And I think actually I can see the distress start building, almost like when you are so sure of yourself and then suddenly the society or, the medical society or the professional body start doubting what you presented with. I think that's when the distress phase starts to happen. So I thought that was very interesting how related back to what Colin's example is actually sometimes the conviction within oneself, when we are really sure of who we are, actually wasn't the cause of the distress. Sometimes the conflict when what you're sure of yourself compared to what society, I'm going to make it slightly bigger, like community or society, put against it, that is when it's causing the distress. Colin, would you agree or disagree or neutral?
I think what you've just highlighted is the paradigm of conflict that yoga addresses. Firstly, it's to do with who I think I am versus who I actually am, versus who I want to be versus who I can actually be, versus who other people see me as, and who I think other people see me as. So there seems to be this sort of paradigm of these different viewpoints that are all basically constructed from different aspects of identification. And it's the way that, and it's through identification that we start to get reference points about what we feel is comfortable for us and gives us a stable sense of our reality and perspective. And so yoga starts with this idea. It starts with this idea of how we put these things into the ground. And it starts to propose numbers of different processes to look at shifting our perspective so that we can be much more comfortable with who we are, no matter what other people say to us, no matter what we say to us as well. So in a way, what we've got situations where we're creating different labels and identities to try and describe and articulate in a very primitive way, because remember how primitive we are with regard to articulating feelings. The words that I'm using right now to try and communicate with you, Stanford, are really quite poor, you know what I mean? But this is how we are, is that I'm trying to construct these words and trying to put these words together in a sentence that have a meaning that you can hold on to, that then link to the feeling that's deep within me associated with what I'm trying to express. And when there is dysphoria, it's almost that there's a mismatch of what's going on deep inside to what's coming out, and how we can express and articulate that, and then what that means to us, and then what that means to someone else, and then how we're in our cumbersome way trying to communicate this sort of distress that's happening. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes total sense. And I think even on the most basic level of language, it can be, as you said, primitive. Like the terms gender and sex, I think for most people, and I think I have to admit, until I really researched into the area, I would thought they are one and the same. But actually, even just that very small difference in word make a huge lot of difference. So sex is kind of our biological makeup, is what a chromosome tell us. And of course, I'm now being quite general and broad because the sex that we're born into is not necessarily what display outwardly. There are rare genetic disposition where, like say, the Y chromosome, so the male chromosome didn't get displayed, and actually you are born chromosomically a man, but outwardly you become a woman, and that is rare, but it does happen. So I'm just going to say, generally speaking, sex is what your XY chromosomes tell you. So XX is woman, XY is a man. What's gender is more a self identity, like how do you identify with it? And I think one of the best examples that I can think of about how it can actually cause a problem is, say, ethnicity. So I'm 100% Chinese by biological trait. Both my parents are from Shanghai. They are from Chinese. So biologically, I'm 100% Chinese. But I actually lived in this country since I was 13. So I'm now 30 something. So I'll let you do the math. And, you know, I do identify myself as a British as well as the Chinese. So I am both. But when a person meets me without having in-depth knowledge or even heard me speak, probably just assume I'm Chinese. So I think it's as simple as that. So I wouldn't say, because I may get a little bit annoyed if people keep telling me that I'm not British, but I'm not going to be too distressed or anxious about it. So I can't say that I can completely sympathize and empathize with people who has, you know, gender dysphoria. But I think as Colin was saying, identity, there is incongruent in so many different ways. But now I'm so interested to hand it back to Colin so he can tell us what yoga says, that how we can deal with this incongruence and this stress and this fear sometimes.
The first thing is that the only way to exist and find a reference point within the world is through identity. So, and we create identities at every single level and reference points at every single level in order to construct our reality. So it becomes very necessary to have identity and reference points. The journey presented is in 4 steps. The first step is to do with understanding the reality of how these identifications are actually being constructed. So we call this heiame. It means that we need to understand the reality, the symptoms that are being actually expressed. So what you mentioned is you mentioned distress. Quite often it's a very, very deep, and I mean a very deep emotional constriction. And this deep emotional constriction has other knock-on effects within the system. Often the thinking of the person and what they associate with, and the things that they associate with, and how they associate with things will be tainted by a lot of the identities and rules they've put in place. And the identities and rules that we put in place, some of them are learned and a lot of them come from our environment. So we've got sort of 75% environmental, 25% inherited. And a lot of the rules that we lay down, we actually think are fixed. We believe that these are fixed rules about something, the way that something should be. And then we construct our life based on those rules. However, through the process of yoga, what we're looking to do is be aware of how we come to interact with ourselves, how we interact with the world. So there's this kind of movement of interaction, understanding the different rules that we're laying down, how we're interacting with those rules, and how those rules can actually be slightly changed so we can be more comfortable, more content with who we are. So the bigger picture is that actually we can be content, or we can accept who we are no matter the situation. And this is from my experience, it's a long-term process. It's not a short, fast fix. I've been working with someone recently and we've been working together for 1 year and there's been strong dysphoria. And finally, she's been able to say, I have, you know, I have a good feeling about myself and I can continue and move forwards. To get to that point, there has to be a series of questions, a series of tasks that are given, where the person is starting to look at their interactions, to be aware about how they're interacting with themselves, interacting with others, how these actions are tainted with different things, often tainted with anger. And quite often this happens in these type of situations. There's a lot of anger involved and a lot of attachment to identity involved. And this attachment to identity and this anger, which has a strong desire to it, often come to the foreground and actually stop the person from moving forwards within their life. So for me, this is the starting point of the process, is to understand the reality of the situation, which means to understand the symptoms that are being presented, to understand how the person, you have to remember, it's completely unique. So I can give you lots of different ideas, but the way that all of this is going to be constructed and put together to help someone on a journey is going to be completely unique. Completely unique. I don't know, does that make sense, Stanford?
Yes, always make a lot of sense. And I think the emotional constriction, or actually the anger that you spoke about, is very, almost is the core of where the problem is. And I think part of it, again, I'm going to bring it back to like a societal point of view, where when gender, I'm going to use the correct term now, gender, I know we no longer champion that, which is a good thing, but gender is no longer seen as a binary thing. You know, it's not either male or female, it's actually a spectrum, it can be a range. Then that kind of take the expectation away a little bit, take the pressure off the lid a little bit, so to speak, because I think it can be very difficult when there's only two categories in the world. You're either A or B. You can't be anything else. You can't be anything in between. And it feels very limited. You know, for some people, maybe when you go to a department store and saying, I'm going to buy some pants, if there's only two choices, it's a comfort. Some people do find that, and that's absolutely nothing wrong about that. However, personally, I like a little bit more choice. Like sometimes some of them are low crotch, some of them are higher, some of them tighter, some of them are really relaxed jeans. Like having a choice to be able to express yourself, or a range on how to express yourself, I think is a much better freedom in our society and community. And also it makes it more beautiful. It gives, you know, the freedom for people to express, so that, you know, different things can be created, art, movies, music, and so on and so forth. And I think that is something in a slightly general, broader term should be regarded, so to speak. And I think in a way it kind of helps a little bit back in the 80s, 90s, I think, when the term cis and trans comes into play. So cis, again, I learned this during a lot of my research as well. So if I'm explaining it to people who already have a lot more knowledge, I'd apologize. So cis, if you are identifying very clearly with your biological identity, is cis, so cis men or women. If you are trans men or women, then you are identifying yourself kind of the other gender that you didn't born into. You didn't get experience gender, which I think is a really good word, experience gender, which is used by the DSM-5 category instead of born into or biological, because it makes it more experiential, it's more behavior, and it's more societal, community-based one. And I think when we were doing the promotion for this talk within our team, we actually have a little chat about this, where thus gender dysphoria means transsexuality or transgender, and we kind of almost have half an hour debate on this topic itself, because transgender or transsexualism doesn't always have to cause distress. You know, just being identified with the gender that you're not experienced since birth doesn't actually automatically cause anxiety and distress, as I've hopefully explained a little bit earlier on. So the two things are not quite one and the same, although most classifications do. And in some way, I think that added to the problem. You know, as a medical bodies, if we as doctors, I have to say, really reflect, if I see them as one and the same, I naturally assumed this group of our population will be experiencing distress and discomfort. It's like anyone who walked through the door wearing blue socks will be experiencing discomfort. And that's almost a little bit dangerous, because it not necessarily. Some people are very happy to know that what gender they are born into, they are identifying with. And yes, they might have to go for a few extra things, maybe gender reassignment surgery, maybe, I don't know, cross-dressing, to help them to find comfort into the society, but not necessarily has an innate disease. And I think that disease actually sometimes put on top of them a little bit. Colin, do you have anything to say to that?
I do, actually, because when you were saying that, it made me think about the opening third part of the Sankhya Karika, and also the fourth chapter of Yoga Sutra, and the way that as a yoga teacher or yoga therapist, you work with other people. And the first, when you're working with people, it's no judgment. Absolutely, they should feel no judgment at all from you. And I mean no judgment. It means that if you're okay with it, even if they're not okay with it, it starts to be okay, because part of the process of working with different symptoms that are being presented by people is being able to hold them in a space of no judgment, where they feel held and safe, that they can move forward and investigate the feelings that they've got. And so I was thinking about this idea that, just as you were speaking, that came to me with regard to no judgment and the traps associated with classifications about how things should be or how things ought to be. And quite often we don't realize how those things are actually imposed on us, or we adopt the view of something based on how we think it ought to be or should be. And it's a trap. It's a real trap, because it keeps us very, very narrow. And the spectrum that you were talking about is one of acceptance that each of us is a completely different person and is entitled to our different perception. And we need to respect someone else's perspective completely. And so this was coming to me as you were kind of talking about that. And then I had this other vision about the beginning of, and this is, when you're working with people, this is what you feel, their experience is very valid. It's a valid, very valid experience, and we need to respect that experience and not judge it at all. And so for me, this is very much a starting point. And the other thing that made me smile a little is I was just thinking about the opening of the Sankhya Karika, which it lays the foundation for yoga philosophy, as you know, and also Ayurveda as well. And some of the guys here are doing work with me on the Sankhya Karika at the moment. And one of the lines is it says that the material world, so it defines the material world as being everything that constructs your material body, your mind, your thoughts, your emotions, your intelligence, your identities, your feelings. The whole of the material world can be divided again and again and again, and categorized again and again and again, and labeled again and again and again. And it can be the most incredible spectrum. And then it gives a line and says, well, this is not who you are. And it's kind of a bit powerful, because it's who we think we are. It's how we construct who we actually think we are. And so when you were talking about that, I was just sort of reflecting on these areas. So thank you for that.
That's okay. And I'm reflecting on the term label, and I think maybe we mentioned that term or that thing over a few talks, and I always wanted to say something about it, so maybe I just will now. And I think, I don't know about you, you please do share your experience, but I sometimes feel like labeling, it's helpful. As a medical doctor, patients come to me a lot of the time to find labels. That label is called diagnosis. I've been having this pain. I've been having this tightness there. I've been having this lump and bulge. They want to know what it is. And the name that I'll give them, the diagnosis itself is a label. And usually, very often in the beginning, I find that to be helpful because almost like, parts of the puzzles, a piece of the puzzle is finally falling into the right place. They know what it is. There's a like easing off. You can see the shoulder going. You can see, the lines between the eyebrows easing off a little bit. It's like, oh, that's what it is. And yes, we can start working onto the problems and the patient will be happy for a little bit. But then fast forward a few years down the line, I don't know, sometimes I find actually the label is the thing that causing the tension again, the shoulder growing up and up and up, and the lines between the eyebrows going deeper once again. Because that label, as you said very beautifully, and yourself and in yoga, it becomes an identity. I have sciatica, I can't move anything, okay? I have flat foot, so I can't walk or run, okay? I have diabetes, I can't have that, I can't come to that party, okay? And I very often, I don't know, maybe I'm going a bit too deep in my clinic room, but I'll very often think like, is that true? Like, is it really true that just because you have lower back pain quite often, you can't move anything? Is it quite true that you have a car accident 10 years ago that you can no longer, say, do yoga? Is that just like our gender and other experience? Would that be a spectrum? Maybe there's a little bit of exercise that you can do. Maybe a select or handful of parties that you can go to as diabetes or as a diabetic patient. When I do often wonder, when does that label help you to ease that tension, and when is the pivotal point when the label actually gives you more tension? Colin, what about you? What were your case study telling us?
Well, all you did, every case study has exactly this. And the line from Yoga Sutra, Vrittaya Panchataya Klishta Klishta. It's the idea that every single label, every single identity that we put down, every single memory that is born out of experience, every single way that we use our imagination, every way we cognize everything, whether we understand it correctly or misunderstand it, everything can either be hurtful to us or not hurtful. And the line is going to be different from each person. And often we don't realize when something has become hurtful because we're so used to it. And the laying down of patterns is something that is pivotal to yoga. Now, I discussed symptoms earlier on, and sort of the first step for me is looking at symptoms. The second is looking at causes. And you mentioned so well about the environment and how there is this impact from other sources with regard to the laying down of patterns and experience and labels. In yoga, we don't dig in a box. What that means is that the past is done. We're not going to sit there looking again and again. And we actually look at two steps as being disastrous. The first one is the step of excuses. Okay, and this is directly from the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, is that excuses, this way that we actually stop from stepping up and facing our reality. Because when we face our reality, we can step and move forwards. So the first thing we do is we create excuses, huge numbers of excuses. Dr. Stanford, I'd love to see you this evening, but unfortunately I can't. My unicorn is just out at the moment. I've got to gather it and get it back in. I'm really sorry. Can we reschedule for another time? I'll message you next week to reschedule. Is that okay? So we come up with no. So we actually come up with excuses, and you see, a good therapist needs to be able to outmaneuver excuses that people put in. And when you're dealing with such a sensitive subject matter, such as this, you need to be aware about how people lay down certain traps so they become excuses. Okay, it's kind of interesting. So this is the first thing that people do, is they create lots of different excuses about things, lots of distractions around things, and pointing in different directions. The second thing is blame. Okay, so they go into different blame zones. And different blame zones is when they point fingers in different ways, shapes and forms. So it's like, my parents, you did this, that happened, this is like this, I'm like that, you're like this. We go through this whole kind of blame routine. And it appears in lots of different ways, shapes and forms, but both of these two need to be outmaneuvered in order for someone to start to go on the journey with regard to what they need to face with regard to dysphoria. Does that make any sense?
It does. I'm smiling and laughing here because I don't know why, and please don't be offended. Your speech remind me of a birthday card joke that I read some time ago. Don't ask for the past, it's all gone and done. Don't ask for the future, it hasn't arrived yet. Don't ask for the present, I haven't got you any. But in some way, because the more you speak, and that's why I think it reminded me of it. It has a lot of philosophical truth in it. The past is gone, the future hasn't arrived, and your present can't be given by someone else. It is your present, and you have to, give yourself that. You kind of have to own it, and that's why I'm laughing here. It's like, actually, that card was much deeper than I thought, or maybe I'm reading too much into things again. So yeah, I think. Okay, going to bring it back a little bit more to the topic that we're going to talk about as well. And I think part of the labeling that doesn't help in terms of gender dysphoria is also the sexuality. So I'm going to go into male and female gender because otherwise it's going to be even more confusing for myself. So if they're early onset, so if they identify like as a trans community earlier on in their development, very often they will either identify themselves, if they are male, they will identify themselves as gay or homosexual. If they are later onset, they will identify themselves actually as lesbians. So interestingly, it depends on what time study have shown, what time and when the gender dysphoria is realized, or I should say the transgenderism is realized. It seems to have an effect on the sexuality, and vice versa for women it's the same. Sorry, for females the same. If they're early onset, they more often identify themselves as lesbians, and if later onset, they're more likely to identify themselves as gay. And I think I bring this up because I think this is an additional layer to the whole thing, where if the societal gender spectrum is already a little bit confusing for them, now they have to own their sexuality. It's going to be a little bit more difficult because where are they on that spectrum? And also from their partner, who is my loved one? Are they male? Are they female? Are they gay? Are they lesbian? Like, or are they heterosexual? These are all some of the many questions that they have to go through, and I do really feel for them when I say this, because just thinking about it and just writing it down in paper is confusing enough, and I can't really begin to imagine what it is like to live with that. And I think truly this is one of the reasons why I felt it's important for us to include this topic in the APC webinar, despite the fact that it's not the easiest to go, because part of my role, I again, as a medical profession, actually to increase the awareness of, what we say is the minority or the LGBTQ community, or, any other minority in our normal societal spectrum is important, because I won't ask any of you to try to experience what they experience, but I think just to be aware that there are different experiences out there is important. And I think that's part of the reason why I've gone for this topic. But yeah, Colin, may I ask, I know I suggest this topic and you may or may not have begrudgingly agree. Why did you agree to do this topic?
I felt I had no choice.
Hey!
No, why I agreed to do this topic is that for me, it's about individuals. And as a yoga therapist and someone that's working with people that are in very difficult situations, whether it's end of life situations, whether it's dealing with cancer, whether it's dealing with something deep like this situation, to have the capacity to be there and to not to reduce dependency on someone like myself, but increase the confidence in someone to deal with the issue that they're going through. No matter the label that issue has, it's, for me, it's all about the individual, and yoga is all about the individual. It's actually, I feel it's actually, it's anti-tradition, it's anarchic in its way. It's going against absolutely everything. And it's giving power back to a person. And for me, to begin to start to, in a very clumsy way, get the message across about how this is possible is the reason why I'd love to do this and why I'm here doing this. Because when we sit and think about it, we start to see how patterns are laid down for a person, how their belief system is, what they believe, what they don't believe, what they think they know, and also how they don't know what they don't know, how they're aware of some things, but yet they don't believe that the things they're not aware of actually don't exist when they actually do exist. And to take someone on a journey which is their journey, and you're side by side with them, almost like in their pockets, to give them tasks, give them direction, use the tools of yoga which are there to help someone to be more comfortable with themselves, so that actually they move from a place where they are deeply agitated, to a place where they actually have contentment, a place where there isn't any good quality of mind, but actually they can find a good quality of mind. That actually there is no peace within themselves, but they can actually find some peace. Where they don't feel free, they feel oppressed in every which way, shape and form, and they can actually find some freedom. And for me, that's the promise of yoga. It takes that route.
Oh, by the way, I just been reminded, sorry to cut in, that we now set up the ABC membership, Yoga and Health membership. So if you want to catch up on any of these topics that we've talked about, also you will have extra opportunity to ask us questions outside of these webinar setting as well. So if you're interested, I think the link will be coming up in the chat box very soon. But like coming back to why I was nodding quite furiously earlier on, I think some of the things that you said really hit home. First word was dependence, which very, very much relate to the topic of labels. You know, depending onto the label that we've been given or we are giving ourselves. But yes, also to create that kind of, as you said, almost like a companion for each person's journey is very important, because we know LGBTQ community individuals, as a member myself as well, we are aware that there are more mental health issues. You know, there are more stress, isolation, anxiety, depression, suicidal rate is higher, poor self-esteem, which can come out in many, many different ways, sometimes like eating disorder, very often substance abuse or alcohol dependency. Again, the word dependency. So it is important issues where you know your discomfort, your disease is not resolved. You very often turn to another outlet or turn to something else to provide that high or that comfort, even though it's false, even though it's not a true contentment. You still look for them. And I have to say, medically, we try to help. We try to help. We have drugs, hormones, which actually, thank God, we don't use very often, because we can use hormone to slow down puberty, so that we give, like, especially if there's early onsets for children and teenagers, time to decide what happened. But of course, as you can imagine, holding someone's puberty has really big knock-on effects later on. So usually it's a special court order for us to do that. Surgery, fortunately, in a lot of ways, provide huge comfort, because you're physically reassigning someone into their innate, I would say innate gender, you know, their own desired and wishing to experience gender. Of course, that has a lot of side effects and complications, and also bad long-term consequences. But actually, in a lot of ways, it is one of the best tools that we have. Unfortunately, also irreversible. So, and these individuals tend to go through a lot of psychological counseling, psychiatry assessment, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, to make sure that it's actually something that they really want. Because I think one of the big thing, as well as any other plastic surgery, is regret. Once you've done it, I wish I haven't done that. You know, we all felt that, you know, in some way, shapes or form in our life before, but hopefully with something that's slightly less permanent and also less personal. And I think to have an operation on yourself, I don't know, if any one of you have a tattoo that you really regret, you might be able to relate in some small forms, but, you know, have a major surgery done and then regret afterward, that will cause even more problems. And so, yeah, so that's kind of like the medical way. How about you, Colin? What do you do as the pocket man for these individuals?
Okay, so we come down to either physical issues, psychological issues, or spiritual issues. And the underlying view is that the subtle, the sukshma influences the gross. So what we see on the surface comes from something deep underneath, which means that we're starting to take people on a journey. Using the tools of yoga, we tend not to focus on the issue itself. And I know that this sounds very bizarre, but we don't focus on the issue because we don't reinforce the relationship with the issue. We look to start to lay down a new foundation, a new pattern, a new way of working that supports the person's confidence so that they can face the issue themselves. Now, what this means is that we start to begin to understand the person. We understand their thinking and their relationship with that situation. And then we give tasks, real life tasks and exercises with practices that reinforce a new way of working. We're not looking at hitting the issue head on. This is Abhyasa Vairagya Abhyanta Nirodha. It means that in order for us to be comfortable with something, we have to lay down and practice laying down a new way of working, which means that in lots and lots of situations, we're giving people different tasks and different options, which provide them with different routes and patterns to free up a number of the rules and labels they've put in place that are causing them the constriction within themselves. So it's a kind of, it's unique in the way that it's working. But it means that as a therapist, a yoga therapist, we need to know a way around both the gross and subtle realm and what the possibilities are with regard to the tools, meditative tools, mantra tools, visualization tools, touching tools, who to use what for and why to use it, how to talk to someone, how to give them tasks so that they can engage with someone else in a good framework, so that they can engage with themselves with a good framework and change the pattern of engagement. So the goal is to be comfortable with who we are. And it's complementary. It works alongside anything else.
And I think I really echo that, where again, I wouldn't even begin to say this is my suggestions for people who go through gender dysphorias, because I truly don't understand or never experienced it myself. But I think through working issues of my own, I mean, we all have some, and some of my anger and things like that, I think my take-home lesson for myself is, you know, whatever problem I have, at the end of the day, whenever I really think about it, they're all because of me. They're all caused by myself. You know, I'm angry with someone else. Yes, they have done something wrong, but ultimately, I'm the one who decided to be angry with that person. And I think, especially with working with anger, when you're angry about someone else or are angry with someone else, it almost become a little bit irrelevant, rather the other person know you're angry or not. Realistically, it really doesn't matter whether they know or not, because they are very happily living off their life, and you know, with or without the knowledge, which again fuel my anger. And then I realized, you know, the only one who is damaged by this anger is myself. And recognizing that this emotion doesn't associate with a right or wrong, because you know, I'm a person, as we gone through in the very first talk, having a range of emotions pretty much mean being human. But then holding on to this emotion, is it beneficial to me? Is it damaging to me? I think at that point I need to learn to make a decision. Rather, I want to keep this for myself, or I'm just holding on to it because it's more comforting than changing. Because ultimately, I mean, again, I would not pretend that I'm more experienced than anyone here, but I try changing other people. I very seldomly succeed. I can succeed a little bit more in changing myself. Again, not very often, but I tried, and sometimes I can, more than just my hairstyle. But you know, I can change a few things about myself, and sometimes that makes things a little bit better, because I learn to progress a little bit more, or I learn a few new tools and skills to deal with life situation. Because life is unpredictable. Who knows what pandemic will bring us tomorrow? Maybe a meteor will hit, or maybe, you know, the vaccine work and all the COVID disappear. We never know. But the only thing that I have a little bit more control of is myself. And I think that's why I echo with Colin very much. I think for everyone involved, whatever shapes, form of your dysphoria may be, I will encourage you to hold on to that phrase I just learned from the movie today, from the Danish girl. There's nothing wrong with me. Because, you know, whatever traits that we have and we carry, that we're born with or we develop into, they are part of us. And each trait has its advantage and disadvantage. And sometimes the advantage becomes disadvantage in certain situations, and sometimes vice versa. And I think ultimately, if we can learn to, okay, I'm going to say, stop saying we, I'm going to say I. If I can learn to tell myself there's actually nothing wrong about me, there's not much I need to change. Maybe it's just my perception of myself I need to change. That may make me a bit happier. Sorry if I'm rambling. I'm not sure if this is relevant or if this is slowly going into my cloud of imagination. Colin, I'll let you wrap up.
I agree with you completely. I mean, the way that we learn about ourselves is because of our interaction with other people. And I was discussing this with the meditation group, is that in meditation, everything about yourself is exposed by the interaction you have with what you're meditating on. And so again and again, it's the observation of the way that we come to hold the things that we hold in our life. And beginning to understand like you mentioned so well, the attachment, the sticky things, the desire, the wanting, the way that we identify those things, and whether they're hurtful to us or not hurtful to us. And something like anger is a beautiful thing. It's It's an unsatiated desire. It's desire that hasn't, well, I want something and I don't get it. And so it is a beautiful subject matter. And sometimes something like anger, as I've discussed with someone recently, gives you the power to do incredible things, and you actually don't want your anger taken away. And at other times, that anger just consumes and burns and destroys you. So, you know, with what you're saying, I understand, you know, and I've seen it again and again and again. And it's, again, it's individual with regard to the decisions and the approaches and listening to what people want. I remember someone looking at me and going, "Do not take my anger from me. It protects me and it gives me power. Don't take it." You know, and it's stuff like that that you just kind of, as a yoga therapist, you have to listen to. You have to really understand that actually, in one way, it can be really hurtful to them. In another way, it's very protective, and it brings them forward. And I think with any kind of dysphoria, any sort of situation, we need to step back and really understand it clearly, understand the person's story completely, and be engaged with them as part of the journey forward. And that whatever they're presenting, it's okay. It's really okay. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Stanford, so much. I've learned so much from you this evening. So thank you.
And vice versa. Thank you everyone for staying tonight with this sticky subject. Thank you very much. I think next one, what are we talking about next time? Actually, is for
hypermobility.
Right. See you next time.
Okay, so we're going to be discussing hypermobility next time, which is when you can get your legs over your head. And
I can't.
No, so discussing approaches to hypermobility. So we'll be looking at the structure of a person with hypermobility. And we'll be also looking at Western ideas on hypermobility and also yoga's perspective on hypermobility as well. Okay, so thank you so much for coming, guys, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.